as we do each week as Baylor enters their next game. And, of course, Oklahoma State on Saturday at McLean Stadium at 2:30. Sam Bradshaw from Sic'Em365.com, football analyst, joins us on this Friday. Sam, 2 games last year. They were both physical. Baylor, of course, almost blew the doors open before Oklahoma State came back last year in the championship game. Any similarities you see to each team this year?
I think both teams have a lot of similarity to what they did last year schematically. Oklahoma State's got a new defensive coordinator, but a lot of the scheme they're running is very similar. So you miss some of the bells and whistles that Jim Knowles had, but a lot of what they're doing is very, very similar. And, Baylor has the same scheme, but you've got a lot of spaces. Baylor's skill weapons at running back and receiver have largely turned over. Oklahoma State's back 7 has largely turned over on defense, so that'll be something to watch. And then on the other matchup, Oklahoma State has lost 2 or 3 starting linemen from last year. And and they also lost Jalen Warren and Tay Martin, who were 2 of their best skill guys, as well as the 2 backup running backs that they had last year, including Desmond Jackson, who was stopped at the 1-inch line on the final play of the game. So it'll be interesting to see how everything goes. I think Baylor should be able to limit their running game with just their down front and not really have to involve their safeties much at all to limit the run. So Oklahoma State's going to go about as far as Spencer Sanders can throw them.
Is that, do you feel that that's a better proposition this year than last?
Well, the interesting thing about Sanders is he's thrown about 1.5% of his attempts as interceptions against teams not named Baylor. And it's north of 9% in his last 2 games against Baylor. So whether it's something that Aranda's doing schematically or whether it's something that you're seeing that it's just the amount of pressure that Baylor's able to get from some pretty conservative coverage looks, whatever it is, it's clearly getting to the guy. And if Baylor can keep that up, that's going to be a huge, huge benefit going into tomorrow.
Sam, what were your main takeaways from the showing last week against Iowa State? I mean, obviously they proved they could go out on the road and win a game, which is something we were, kind of waiting to see and has been a bit of a struggle. Blake Chapin played really sharp, got some turnovers. I don't want to take all your answers here, but those are top of mind for me. What else for you?
I liked the approach on the road. I liked the fact that they stuck with the running game and were physical with it against a very physical and disciplined Iowa State defensive front. Iowa State's a team that they're going to keep everything in front of them, and they're going to make you block some of the best D linemen in the conference over and over and over again. And they've got really good linebackers. I mean, Orion Vance and Gary Vaughn, the 2 guys that are typically their inside guys, they've been around forever. They may not be the biggest names, but they're very good against the run. So to be able to get a pretty productive game out of Reese and a couple of the other backs was huge. If you can do that against them, you can do it against a lot of teams in this conference. And then also just to see a good game out of Chapin and the receivers. They responded to one challenge with Iowa State's very conservative zone coverages, keep everything in front of them philosophy. And a lot of what they weren't able to execute on at BYU against some of those looks, they were able to do in Ames. And this week it gets pretty different. Oklahoma State is not afraid to come after you. And frankly, they kind of had to do a little more blitzing against a couple of their FBS opponents so far in Central Michigan and Arizona State in order to shore up some run defense issues that were plaguing them early in those games. It'll be a very different challenge for this passing game because you're going to have these guys go and beat somebody that's playing them close. It's going to be a lot more of what they saw against Texas State than what they saw against Iowa State schematically.
What did Baylor do to give Blake Chapin a little bit more comfort level on the perimeter to have that option to run or throw?
Well, I think they did a good job of scheming up some looks. Iowa State, generally what they're going to do going into the game. They recruit to it, they do it, and they change up their looks, but it's generally keep everybody in front of you, change up your coverage, try and force the offense into executing a lot or getting mistakes. And based off of that, Baylor was able to get into some formations, get some things off play action. because when you're trying to keep everybody deep, there's only so many people you have up close, which means there's a lot of bootlegs that can potentially come open, especially if your passing game's hitting downfield, as it was with Chapin, to keep people camping off of those just quick boot actions and other things like that were coming open. And I think you'll see some of that against Oklahoma State. They've got some very inexperienced guys at a couple safety spots, at a couple linebacker spots, at corner spots. So I'm anticipating Baylor throwing a lot of motion, a lot of misdirection, and making these guys show that they can get their assignments right.
Sam, you mentioned about throwing the crossing routes. Do you think this is a big game for Ben Sims, potentially because of the inexperience there in the middle?
I think it's potentially a big game for all the tight ends. I think Oklahoma State has a smaller guy at their field safety position, and one of their middle safeties isn't exactly the biggest guy. So you've got some size matchups that those tight ends can go win, and you have the ability to scheme them open, formation the defense into some looks that should give you favorable matchups. I think the tight ends are a big weapon in this game, and a weapon that I think Baylor has a lot better options at than Oklahoma State does. Oklahoma State has some really, really good skill guys on offense on the running back and receiver room. But from the tight end standpoint, they got a lot of guys who are blockers. They got a lot of guys who are receivers. I don't think they have anybody like Sims that's kind of the whole package.
Sam, do you think that the defense has perhaps broken the seal in the turnover game?
Potentially, with turnovers, a lot of it is disrupting the offense, and a lot of it is luck. A tip pass here,
right.
You do it 10 times, 3 times you get an opportunity to pick it. And does it bounce the right way? I think you'll get a little bit more of it as Baylor breaks out some more of their defensive scheme, because early in the year, whether it was Jaron Hall wanting to keep as many people back to keep him in front of you, and BYU's offensive line doing a really good job of picking up your pressures, or if it was the other 2 early games where you're like, we don't need to break everything out to limit these guys. Let's keep everything off of film so these upcoming offensive lines don't have an extra ability to study us. I think you're going to see them break out a lot more of their pressure packages and break out a lot of the looks that guys are getting really good at. And I think that's, to a certain degree, why you've seen some of the Jack linebackers have a much more productive game in Ames than they did before, because they were finally kind of turned loose with a lot of the pressure packages that have been held back.
Oklahoma State last year and Baylor were like just 2 people grinding on each other. Chapin had that huge first half, and then we know he kind of got shut down a little bit with that shoulder. Do you expect that, or do you feel like one team, if they get an extra turnover or 2, has a chance to separate?
I think both teams potentially have the chance to separate. For Oklahoma State, they've got to hit big plays on the outside. They've got to get skill guys carrying it. I don't think they're going to be able to win just leaning on the Baylor defense. I don't think that's a recipe for success with them, given the turnover they have had on the offensive line and just how good that Baylor defensive front is at limiting the run. And on the other side, I think Oklahoma State, they're going to be a lot more aggressive trying to deny the run. And it's been an up and down adventure for them. There were times where Central Michigan was able to run on them. There were times where Arizona State was able to run on them, so much that I felt like they had to kind of throw in a lot more run blitzes than they probably wanted to going into those games in order to get it under control. And I think that's a situation where if you're doing that, you could get a tackle for a loss one play, but if one person gets out of his gap, that's 60 yards down the other side of the field as the long run that Arizona State had basically right out of the gate. I think a linebacker filled a wrong gap as they blitzed the safety, and there was nobody home. And they eventually ran the guy down, but it was a huge, huge play that led to points. I think it's a game where Baylor can pull away. I favor Baylor in this one. I think Baylor's going to score 5 times. I think Oklahoma State's going to score 4 times. And I just think the advantage in stopping the run is going to be to Baylor's benefit. I think Baylor's going to be able to get more reliable yards than Oklahoma State is. And I think Oklahoma State's really going to have to lean on that passing game in order to get the production they need to win this.
Sam Bradshaw, S11, of course, football analyst for Sic'Em365.com and also for 365 Sports. You mentioned Sanders and what Baylor's defense does and whether it's a scheme or whatever else. When I've watched him, and yeah, I know they haven't quite been tested, but when I have watched him, he does seem to be playing with more confidence and seems to be making even smarter plays with his feet. Is that an issue for Baylor when he gets outside the pocket?
Well, there's two issues I see with Sanders' feet. Not just the scrambles, because you need to rush under control. And I think Baylor did a better job of rushing under control in recent weeks because they've faced some mobile quarterbacks at BYU and at Iowa State. But beyond that, the design quarterback runs, if you're trying to keep your safeties back, there's the potential for them to outnumber you in the running game. And not so much on the downhill runs, because I feel like Baylor did an excellent job at shutting quarterback read game or quarterback power or quarterback off tackle down. The issue that I worry about more is, okay, we stopped the run. Now we're pass rushing. Oh, it's a quarterback draw. Those are the kind of plays that I worry about stopping. It's not necessarily that they're overpowering you. It's that they get you to run out of the way because you're trying to get pressure on the quarterback. So rush lane integrity and not getting suckered by a draw play is where I really worry about corralling him.
Yeah, you're talking about a planned quarterback type draw or keeper?
Yeah. With Oklahoma State, you have a fair amount of design quarterback runs, both as you have the option to keep it or hand off, but also with run pass options where the line is blocking for a draw play and they also have a short passing concept available to them. And the quarterback would have the running back hypothetically leading for him. So there's a lot to account for because last year Baylor was able to break a lot of what Oklahoma State wanted to do in that title game by just lining up and their front seven dominating Oklahoma State's seven blockers, which allowed them to keep two safeties back, which meant that diamond formation they love to get in to get single matchups for the receivers outside. They weren't able to get the single matchups and they weren't able to run. And even some of the times that they tried to use tight ends leading outside for Spencer Sanders on read option plays out of that set, those got blown up. And Baylor was able to do it from safe coverages. Oak State either needs to have a solution to that or they need a really, really good passing game out of Spencer Sanders in order to get a bigger production day out of that offense.
Sam, did last week change your idea or give you any more confidence in some of the positions that have been deficient? You know, Baylor's DBs got on the act last week. Turnovers, wide receivers had their best game. Is that progress yet, or is that too early to tell?
I think they took some good steps forward, but I think a lot of what you're dealing with is you knew that they were going to break out more scheme on both sides of the ball, which they did. And you knew you'd have a pretty good idea of where those receivers stand against zone coverages as a result of that game. And I think you passed with flying colors there. But I think there's some other tests coming up. You're going to have some teams that are going to get in the receiver's face a little more. You're also going to have some offenses that are going to spread you out a little more and not have the recruiting ability of a Texas State, for instance. And how do you handle those? And how do you handle the new ways they try and break what you're doing schematically? I think that's the challenge to see what they do next step. This team still has the ability to go win the Big 12 and do it emphatically, but they got to keep improving. Last year's team did not show up in Stillwater the way that they were playing down the stretch. And I think you'll see them get better the same way last year did as they go on. I think it was a great step in the right direction, but the teams coming up on the schedule are going to challenge you on the chalkboard and in personnel matchups a little differently than Iowa State would, than BYU would, or than how Texas State did.
Sam, as always, thank you very much breaking it down for us with the X's and O's. He writes some amazing stuff following and even leading into each weekend. Sam Bradshaw, S11, with us on Fridays in 365 Sports. Coming up next, Paul Catalina wraps up the week with his top 5 on 365 Sports.